So here we are at what I think is the final screencast in this series of screencasts for week 6, looking at Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited, specifically the chapter on Japan. And we were just discussing some of the comments from a person in our class, as well as some of the actual statements from page 116, talking about this idea of children interacting. And I was trying to quite frankly, complicate the situation at the end of the last screencast by saying that comments like, the way that physical intimacy is usually understood in the West is a dichotomizing statement that doesn't really hold up when we look at examples from around the world where there are multiple cultures in multiple locations, both in the West and in places traditionally not considered the West. And certainly not all industrialized or developed or developing or emerging or whatever, that have different and varying levels of familiarity with and comfort with levels of physical intimacy among children and adults. Now, this is possibly one of the, for me anyway, I think one of the most interesting examples of where globalization and contextualization interact. And I think it's because issues of physical intimacy between adults and children is a touchstone point in many cultures around the world, either for good or for bad, either in favor of it happening and it's no big deal and it's just the way that life happens, versus the ways that we change our perceptions. And there's a section in the book where they talk about how people who had lived in Japan previously and were returning there found that there was this bourgeoisization, whatever the word is, transition in society in Japan that was even making the public baths, the onsen, be less and less popular because younger Japanese were more conscious about their bodies than older Japanese or earlier generations of Japanese had been. And so they were not as comfortable being naked around other people. And that was just around people that they wouldn't interact with necessarily. They'd just be in the public bath together. And that had changed. They're suggesting that is because there is this globalization of more Western, I would say probably more American and more puritanical perspectives on the body than anything else. And it's kind of cited as a negative impact of globalization. So what I want to pair with that is an expansion of a very kind of Western originated idea about safety and sexual safety in particular for young children and youth from adults and from each other, which I think an awareness of safety issues is not necessarily as negative of a way of talking about the globalization of a particular idea or approach or framework for thinking about physical interaction. And so we have this sort of dual struggle between more puritanical, ooh, we don't want to do that, that isn't right, with this morality cloak over it, versus more of a, we want to protect, we want to ensure the safety of, we want to nurture our children, and it would be more difficult to do that when there's the possible threat of some sort of physical misconduct. I hope that makes sense. I'm kind of stumbling over my words a little bit because I want to make sure that I get the wording correct and that I'm not misinterpreted, but I feel that I may have muddied the waters. So feel free to continue to discuss this on our discussion board and bring your own perspectives and your own comments to this. I think that will make our discussion much more valuable. And having said that, let me pose a couple of questions that I would like to just throw out there that hopefully you can be addressing on the discussion board as well this week. One is, since we've looked at both China and Japan so far in Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited, let's ask, in what ways do Chinese and Japanese preschools, both considered group-oriented by Americans, actually differ in their approaches to group identity? How do they differ in their approaches to group identity? And how do these approaches reflect the larger society and culture? So we talked about some of this earlier, that there was this Confucianism approach that was in the Chinese preschools. There was this sort of non-interventionist approach that was in the Japanese school systems, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. In fact, they're very distinct in many ways. And so how do we talk about those differences? How do we talk about those differences in light of the more institutionalized model of formal education, at the preschool level, that occurs in Japan and China? And how do these approaches reflect this larger society and culture that is embedding itself or resisting even the institutionalized mass education model that is expressed through preschools? Next, what are the most important things for children to learn or experience in preschool? This was a question that the original Preschool in Three Cultures asked. And I'm curious still about what the answer is. What are some of the differences and similarities in answer to this question in China and Japan? Because, actually, let me just add a third part of this. And then what would be the globally legitimized answer to this question? Like, what if we had to lay out three options: a Chinese answer, a Japanese answer, and the United Nations answer? Which one what would each one of those be? I think that would be fascinating, because then we can start to think about, well, how are our expectations and ideas about preschool and about young children's education shared worldwide, versus what are the unique conditions and purposes that are set by cultural context. Next, what does this tell us about the impact of globalization and contextualization on child socialization, development, and learning in these nations' cultures and education systems? So again, if we can see what the globally institutionalized or globally legitimized answer is, and then compare it to a Chinese answer and a Japanese answer, and see where the similarities and differences are, and there will be many of both, then we can start to talk about the impact of globalization and contextualization. Okay, that's your challenge. I very much enjoyed all of these screencasts. I hope that you got something out of watching them, and I'm looking forward to not only reading your comments on the discussion board, but also meeting with you in person next week.